So in Sri Lanka, where I am, it's 11 p.m. So good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. We'll take a few minutes to allow people to join in. But in the meantime, I'd just like to invite you. You can send messages to everyone in the chat. And we can use a few minutes to just introduce ourselves any way you feel comfortable. If you sort of include what you do and what attracted you to this session, that would be useful, but anyway you like to introduce yourself. All right, so let's dive in. So for this session, I'd just like to use the metaphor of a walk. Many movements in history have walked for rights. Gandhi's Salt March, Martin Luther King's March on Washington. This is, of course, not like that. We are in different places, not just physically, but also wherever we are in our own journeys. And maybe we don't even have a common destination or mission. But the invitation is that for a while we can walk together and support each other in that walk. So because we don't have a lot of time, there isn't a huge amount of opportunity to interact while the presentation is going on, although we'll take some time for that at the end. But there will be some moments in between, and I see that as part of this dialogue. So although Yana and myself are hosting this, it's not necessarily that we are experts on this, but we have some ideas that we would like to share, and we want to see what your ideas are as well. And I'm sorry, I just realized I didn't introduce myself. So my name is Sifaan. I'm based in Sri Lanka. I'm a co-founder of a democratic school here, and I'm very passionate about education, respecting all the rights of the child. So just to sort of set a base for the session, could you share in the chat how do you understand the term rights affirming education? Because this is not actually a term that seems to be used in the discourse anyway. It's something I came up with, but I'd just like to know what you think it means. So I pretty much agree with what is being said in the chat. How I sort of saw it was that a lot of times in the rights discourse, education is seen as the enabling right because having an education helps people to access all of the other human rights. It's a quote from some UN document. I can't quite now recall which, but nothing in this talks about your rights while you're being educated. And I believe that more than the outcome, process of education must also advance all other rights, affirm it, validate it by respecting, protecting, and striving to fulfill them. The reason I sort of coined the term was because I couldn't really find a suitable term. Existing rights-based education is there, but I think that's only just acknowledging that education is a right. Although even that actually can't be taken for granted these days because the OECD has the almost 300-page document on how to build a 21st century school system, and it does not even once acknowledge education as a right. So rights affirming is obviously going to be quite challenging to bring into the conversation if people are not even recognizing education as a right, never mind other rights through education. Anyway, a small reflection. There's a picture here, the text, the small child, and the text is saying, if a child cannot learn in the way we teach, we must teach in a way the child can learn. This actually showed up on Facebook earlier today on a friend's feed. So when you see this quote, what comes to your mind? What are your thoughts? What are your reflections? If you could drop it into the chat, it would be really helpful. I will reserve my own comments on this picture for later. For now, I'm just going to leave this picture and move on and just take a small journey on rights. And here we are going to be using the United Nations related documents and instruments on rights because it's something that well, generally internationally accepted and ratified and visible and so on, although there is a bit of concern that some countries feel that these rights were imposed on them, but that's not something we're really able to dive into in this short time. So we're just going to take the rights as they are because we are from many different places, and I think these rights affect our countries, and so it provides a useful foundation, I think. So in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was the first time education was internationally acknowledged as a right, said education shall be directed to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this exact sentence is repeated in the Convention Against Discrimination in Education, in the Convention on Economic, Social, and Political Rights, and in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this is nice, but like we said in the definition, it doesn't say that the process of education must respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Another example in the UDHR, parents choose the kind of education for their children or have the freedom to. In 1960, it has evolved into can choose for their children institutions other than those maintained. So the assumption or definition that schooling is the same as education has now become explicit. It's not that it wasn't meant that way in the UDHR. From the drafting minutes, it's clear they were thinking about schooling. It's just that they did not see a need to make it explicit then. By 1960, it was. By the time we get to 1989, they're talking about the importance of regular school attendance and reducing dropouts. So this idea that schooling is the same as education is now very much entrenched, which seems to be, well, I think the people writing it think this is nice, but it projects that this institutional schooling is inherently a good thing. And the concerns on that, Yana will share more when it's her turn to speak. Another example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child talks about freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, of association, privacy, social security, standard of living, so many rights. But these are all fundamental freedoms that were already in the UDHR. So why did we need another document for this? When it said that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, did that mean it was only for people above 18 years old? And did the respect for fundamental freedoms that they talked about in education mean that children are supposed to learn to respect something that they didn't themselves enjoy? On this, I'm inclined to take a sort of charitable view that the UDHR was meant for everyone, but because the world wasn't applying it for everyone, it needed some sort of affirmative action. In the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it says that a child who is capable of forming his or her own view has a right to express that view and for that right to be taken into account in accordance with the age and maturity of the child, which sounds nice, but it starts off by saying a child who is capable of forming an opinion. So who is deciding whether the child is capable or not? It obviously can't be the child, because if the child has formed an opinion, then by definition, the child is capable of doing it. So it must be somebody else who is forming an opinion on whether the child is capable of forming an opinion or not. And for me, this is gaslighting, right? Because even a newborn child is able to form and express an opinion on things that the child feels, like hunger or cold. So why these discrepancies? And I think it's because children were seen as chattel, not human beings, in the same way that African American people were also chattel slaves. I mean, can you imagine that slave owners proudly declared, and they declared it was a self-evident truth, that all men are created equal and they're endowed with certain unalienable rights? So they're saying this, they're creating a new country, and some people are not men created equal. And in the same way, women were also chattel. So when they said all men are created equal, it meant men and not women. And interestingly, theoretically, African Americans got the right to vote 50 years earlier than women did. In practice, it was a lot more complicated, but at least the constitutional amendment for African Americans came earlier than it did for women in the USA. So although I'm taking US examples here, this is pretty much the international situation. So why I said it's getting better is that by 2009, they were saying that we have to presume that a child has the capacity to form their own views. It's not up to the child to first prove that they have a capacity. By 2001, they were saying that it's not only about human rights in the syllabus or something, but children should also learn about human rights by seeing it in practice. So there was some value coming to their lived experience. By 2009, they were saying that human rights education only when human rights are practiced in the institutions, and now there's certain primacy of the lived experience. And by 2011, they are saying that they're talking about education about human rights, education through human rights, and education for human rights. So this clarity is coming in this period. Things are improving, but none of this is actually happening in practice. So I like to use this metaphor for elephant in the room. It usually means that there is something very visible and very obvious that nobody is talking about. Everybody recognizes it, but nobody is talking about it. And for me, it's actually a case that this elephant is invisible, right? So we are walking around the room, we're bumping into it, and we don't know why we're bumping into it. We are tripping on its trunk or something like that, and we don't know what's happening there. And we are just sort of really confused because we can't talk about something that we can't recognize. And it's not only sort of figuratively tripping up, but in terms of the language we use, also we do trip up. So here I'm going to share something from 2007. These are two sort of captures from two parts of this document. A human rights-based approach to education for all in 2007. And I'm going to give some time where you can share your thoughts in the chat about what you see here. In good programming, it is recognized that people cannot be developed, they must develop themselves. Children should be recognized as key actors. And then about teachers, while infrastructure is vital, it is teachers who have the most impact on the day-to-day experience of children in school. Quality education depends on the commitment, enthusiasm, creativity, and skill of teachers. So anything you notice about this language that you would like to share in the chat? So some of the things that I noticed, so yes, it's great that we recognize that people cannot be developed, they must develop themselves. But why is this under the heading of good programming? I mean, the nature of the word programming itself implies that somebody is trying to program or influence some change someone else. And if people must develop themselves, how is it that it is the teachers who have the most impact on the day-to-day experience of children in school? I would rather think it's the children themselves who have the most impact on their day-to-day experience. How is it that quality education depends on teachers? I mean, teachers can support it, but quality education, I think, depends on teachers only if we make them the only legitimate source of learning, like we had actually in this picture, because this quote in the picture is obviously written from the teacher's point of view. And from the teacher's point of view, I am a teacher is my identity. I'm somebody who's paid to teach. And if I'm not teaching, why am I here? I aspire to be a good teacher. So I, as a good teacher, will teach in a way that the child can learn. So this latent belief is something that I call teacher saviorism. We have to create this idea that children cannot learn unless they are taught by teachers, by qualified teachers, good teachers. Because if we didn't create that, um, then it wouldn't work. And the strange thing is that even children who fail every subject in school learn this lesson that learning depends on teachers. Another one, let's see if there's anything we like to pick up on the language here. Okay, so what I see here, first of all, learning takes place through institutionalized, intentional, and planned education, as well as informally. So again, the institutional learning is the one that is more valued, more recognized, and the informal thing is happening by the way in the site sort of a thing. And um, this is sort of following up from this entrenchment of the idea that schooling equals education. In last year's report by the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, there is a recognition that it's primary education, not primary schooling, that is compulsory, and therefore homeschooling could also be acceptable as freedom of education. So it's like grudgingly accepted. It could be okay, but it's not that much recognized. So this is when we talk about the elephant in the room, if it's paternalism, then that can also be from the state to individuals. So when the state values the institutional education more than what individuals can do, then that's paternalism by the state. But what we're more talking about here is the paternalism from adults towards children. Sometimes this is also called adultism, but I preferred actually the term paternalism because it, I think, conveys a lot more the sort of condescending nature of I know what is better for you. Okay, but getting back to this text, so it's beautiful that they recognize in 2022 that all human beings are born to learn continuously to survive, live, and thrive. Some of us have been saying this for many years. But then a few pages later in the document, one of the key areas in which transformative education must support learners is learning to learn. So are we born doing this, or is this something that we need to learn? If we are born doing this, which is what I believe as well, then one of the key things that support that is curiosity. We are born curious. So then it can't be something, one of these things that we have to be equipped with through the process of education. In fact, the process of education is one of the key things that actually unequips our curiosity, as Ken Robinson has also spoken about quite eloquently. So if at all education must support learners to be curious, it's more about stopping doing many of the things that are prevalent in education, not that they have to do something new for it. Even the term equip every learner. So if all human beings are born to learn and we do this continuously all throughout our life, why are we learners? I mean, all of us breathe all the time. We don't call ourselves breathers. But the reason we have to label somebody as a learner is because we want to establish this paternalism of there is a learner and there is a teacher who is in charge of this learning. A lot of times in any education reports, they will talk about teaching and learning. So it's self-evident for them that learning is the result of teaching. That's the language they're using. And of course, what is happening here is that our systems of schooling were established at a time where children were seen as cattle. So, of course, there was this very paternalistic view that we have to do what is best for these poor things because they couldn't do it by themselves or do anything for themselves. And that attitude was built into the structures of education. It was built into the language of education. And we have inherited that language, we've inherited that structure. So although we have all these really nice ideas about what human rights in education should be and things like that, all these assumptions are holding us back. So, but I'm still hopeful. And the reason I'm hopeful is because of documents like this. So this is from the 2022 Youth Declaration on the Transforming Education Summit. And it says, for too long, we have been excluded or only tokenistically included in the policy and decision-making processes affecting our lives, livelihoods, and futures. In transforming education, we demand that our voices be heard, our lived experiences valued, our demands addressed, and our efforts, leadership, and agency acknowledged. We intend to achieve these goals not as passive beneficiaries, but as partners and collaborators every step of the way. We are not waiting for an invitation to transform education. And why I'm hopeful is because this is the language of the suffragists. This is the language of the civil rights movement. This kind of wording is the language actually of any people who are fighting to overthrow injustice and oppression. But there's something a little bit different between this and the examples. White people do not have a lived experience of being people of color. It's hard to empathize. Cis men do not have the lived experience of cis women. It's hard to empathize. But as child rights defender from France, Edouard Durand said last year, all humans have been children, and yet one of the hardest things for adults to have empathy for is children, because we have internalized the trauma, I would say, inflicted on us as children as being in our best interest. So if we are going to try to paternalistically save children because we know what is best for them, then we are perpetuating that trauma for yet another generation. But if children and young people are leading the way, then we can be their allies, not only then working together, like this quote says, but also walking together on the long march to freedom. So with that, I will end my presentation. Give me a moment to load up Jana's slides, please.
Thank you, Sifaan. Yeah, Sifaan is going to run my slides for me because I'm in the middle of a South African weather situation here. So I'll be on my phone. I also won't be using my video as a result. Apologies for that. But I'm very honored to be here and contributing to this presentation. And what I'd like to do now is take a bit of a look at what can it look like when we let go of paternalism, because that is in fact possible. Often it seems that we're completely surrounded with a kind of a monoculture around education, yet as a number of people on this call already know, we actually have more than 100 years of alternatives to which we can actually compare. So let's have a look at that. Sifaan, if we can have the next slide. So we look around us and we see a lot of different approaches to education that seem to be very diverse. And most of these approaches to education are rooted in shaping the child. Now, the child could be shaped to be a good citizen according to the worldview of those in charge of defining what a good citizen is. For example, with the UN, this might mean that they are rights respecting and law abiding. In Nazi Germany, it meant that they were obedient workers and soldiers. In some religious settings, it means they're true believers. Now, often in the West, it means they'll turn out to be good consumers, and they're good consumers while they're already at school. And all of these are trying to shape the child for the to be good contributors to their society according to somebody's definition. There are also approaches to education that are aiming to shape children for their own good in order that they will have the best possible future as adults. And it doesn't really matter much if children suffer as children and don't have much of an autonomous life as children, because all of that is justifiably compromised in order to give them the best adult life possible. They're not really a human being, they're a human becoming. There are also approaches that aim to shape children to actually have the happiest possible childhood. Sorry, we're still on that previous slide. We can just go back there. The happiest possible childhood while they are at school, as well as the best adult life possible, and try to make that a both and, or all of the above. And now we can pop to that next slide, because what all of these have in common is that they are still aiming to shape the child and the child's education and the educational outcomes on the child's behalf, according to what is believed to be in the best interests of, sometimes blatantly, best interests of the state. In South Africa, we actually have the education department calling our kids national assets. Or it could be in the best interests of the community. We want children who are going to grow up to live sustainably or be peaceful or whatever it might be. It might be the best interests of the family. I remember a father who very much wanted his daughter to be a lawyer because he had dropped out of law school and she had to somehow complete his ambition for him. It can be the best interests of the religion that we manage to keep this going and keep having a whole new generation of devotees. And it can also be increasingly the best interests of the child, as believed to be the case by someone other than the child. And again, various combinations of the above. Next slide. So what all of these approaches have in common is that they begin with education, and then they add on, to a greater or lesser extent, the aim of respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of the child. So education, and then plus rights, we aim for rights respecting education. But the emphasis is on education. Next slide. Prioritizing education before rights creates a danger that rights will not actually end up being fully respected, protected, and promoted, and they may even be significantly compromised or even abused in educational spaces, which is in fact what often happens. So again and again throughout history, this problem gets addressed again and again when it starts to cross certain lines. In 1969, the USA Supreme Court insisted that rights are not lost at the school gates. 30-odd years later, Committee on the Rights of the Child had to remind the whole world that children do not lose their human rights by virtue of passing through the school gates. And still today, the fact of the matter is that rights for young people are routinely compromised in the name of education. Next slide. Some of these abuses are quite dramatic. In many countries, corporal punishment is still completely legal. Even where it is illegal, it can still be very common. In South Africa, we still have many, many teachers and schools practicing corporal punishment, even though it's been outlawed since before the turn of the century, including really severe assaults that get hushed up. A few of them eventually maybe reach the courts. Things like pouring boiling water onto sleeping students. A girl was beaten on her back with a steel pipe. And yeah, this is in the name of it's okay to do these things if what we are doing is supporting the child's education. In the UK, we've seen some posts recently, especially from Naomi Fisher, pointing out that currently there are increasing number of parents who are under pressure to harm family relationships by making home life less pleasant in order to get the children to prefer to go to school. In the USA, especially when there are intersections with other marginalized identities, we see children being handcuffed and arrested, even at the age of 6, just for getting upset in an uncontrolled way, and therefore being criminally charged with disturbing class. And at age 18, there was actually a case where the girl was arrested 100% merely for protesting that another classmate was busy being severely assaulted by a security man who was taking her out of the room for having used her phone. The one being assaulted even ended up in a neck brace with a number of injuries. And both of them were charged criminally with disturbing class. And many, many more, too many to name. Now, a lot of people would agree that these are problematic abuses, but there are a lot of routine, completely socially accepted rights abuses that are treated as completely normal, and people just take them for granted all around the world. So if we just look at the right to freedom of association, thought expression, and the right to be heard and taken seriously, these are some of the most universally compromised rights in schools. It's quite common to lose grades for giving a factually correct or strong alternative answer on a test, simply because this answer conflicts with what is in the official outdated curriculum. Sometimes curricula are written 10 or more years before the test takes place. I know there's still Pluto is a planet in some places, for example. On my own WhatsApp groups in my neighborhood, see people right, but they're losing marks because killer place. And of course, in the school next door, a different method could be taught in a different country, a different one's personal talents in order to firstly have a really fulfilling time now, and secondly, really make the most. I'm not sure what happened there. I'm not sure, but I'm back. Maybe there
You
was a
were
lightning flash
breaking up.
in the
You,
distance.
yeah, you are clear now, Yana.
Yeah. Yes, I think maybe there was a bit of a, as I say, interference from the electrical storm. Being forced to attend specific schools, work with specific teachers, even when there's gross incompatibility, even when education is compromised, and even when young people are suffering mental health impacts. It's still considered perfectly justifiable as long as the overall aim is purported to be helping the child get an education. And then, of course, having no ability to participate and be heard about one's own education at any level, whether in the classroom or at a level of national policy or anywhere in between. All of these things are just considered to be part of the way things work if you are young and busy with your education. Next slide. So if all of this is what results from putting education first and then adding rights on top, like a kind of an attempt to ice the cake, why do we do it? So let's first look at why this happens. Why do we routinely prioritize education above all of the other rights and dignity? And then after that, we'll take a look at what happens when we do things the other way around, putting rights and dignity first. Next slide. So human rights have two basic functions. We have rights of protection. For example, all of us have the right to be safe from torture. And we have rights of empowerment. For example, we all have the right to freedom of expression. And in fact, education itself is an empowerment right because it actually helps us to increase our options, that we don't not just stuck with our life circumstances the way we received them. Paternalism as an attitude, as a way of seeing the world, emphasizes protection and is generally pretty happy with protective rights. But empowerment is supported by a focus on autonomy. And autonomy is not necessarily convenient from a paternalistic point of view. Let's have the next slide. So we can either see protection and empowerment as conflicting, in competition with each other, or we can see them as complementary. Next slide. Paternalism tends to see protection and empowerment as conflicting. Because paternalism is imposing its own interests on other people, it firstly assumes that we need to protect the person from themselves. We know better than they do what will be good for them. And secondly, there's often another agenda in that there's a desire to protect or preserve the role of that person or category of people in our lives for our convenience and for our interests. It maintains our privileges. And from that perspective, also empowering them is dangerous. So this is what was used to justify the disenfranchisement of women. On the one hand, they were considered too silly to be able to vote and be sensible. And on the other hand, it was considered that it would taint their femininity to be too empowered. And in the same way now, we often hear that children are not really capable of making responsible decisions. And at the same time, we also get this argument that it will spoil their cute innocence if they actually become too empowered. Next slide. There's also just the matter of simple convenience. Autonomy tends to come with a lot of variety because this planet is built on diversity. And when you have people being autonomous, it's quite difficult to manage them from a centralized perspective. And paternalism is generally quite keen on having central management. Next slide. So paternalistic protection can be used as a justification for standardizing, centralizing control, and making management convenient, with the myth being that it's easier to protect everyone from the top down, whereas the reality is that there's always someone falling outside of the umbrella, and that's usually someone who was already struggling in some way and has been overlooked. And of course, paternalism's answers are, let's make the umbrellas bigger, or let's find more ways to force all the kids to stay right underneath, which I think is what we're seeing in the UK right now. Obviously, I'm looking from a distance, but that's how it seems. It's certainly the case in South Africa right now. Next slide. The other thing about paternalistic approaches that emphasize protection at the expense of autonomy is that you then have to find some way to co-opt children in spite of their autonomous urges to do something other than you want them to do. So you either have to force them, or you need to find some kind of way to manipulate or seduce or trick them into accepting what you consider to be for their own good. Now, this does allow for a degree of realization of those rights that involve their protection, but it doesn't really allow for any significant realization of empowerment rights. Instead, empowerment is deferred, and it's seen as something they'll have to earn and get later, not something they're entitled to right now. If you can just give it a click there. The result is often rebellion. Of course, some children will just find a way to adapt quietly or go into some kind of depression or collapse, but there'll always be a proportion of children and parents who rebel. And this is just seen as a justification for more control rather than being a message that something needs to change. Next slide. Last, but probably the most important, is that there's actually quite a lot of well-intentioned paternalism. There's a lot of people in the system, probably the majority, I think, who genuinely want to see the best interests of the child protected. And that is a significant factor. The problem being that when you see autonomy, when you see empowerment rights and protective rights as in conflict with each other, then giving autonomy can be seen as a dangerous neglect of protection. Because where exactly is the line between autonomy and empowerment on the one hand and neglect? And when the rights holder has got limited capacity, as in the case of a child, it is true that there is a certain lack of capacity on some levels, then where is that line? At what point will giving them freedom turn into putting them in danger? So this is a very real concern that I think we need to have empathy for and appreciate. Next slide. So prioritizing education before rights creates a danger that rights will not be fully respected, protected, and promoted, and may even be significantly compromised in educational spaces. But on the other hand, the fear is that putting the rights first and then adding the education afterwards, if you still hold that these are in conflict with each other, the empowerment and the protection, then there is a danger that the right to education might not be sufficiently realized. And this could compromise the child's future as a successful adult and a valuable member of society. So one of the questions we receive almost maybe more often than any other in self-directed education is, what if children choose to just play all day and never learn to read? And this is a very real fear that a lot of people have when they see when they see empowerment and protection as being in conflict rather than being complementary. Next slide, please. However, as Derry Hannum says, and I'm thrilled that he's here or at least he was earlier. I hope you're still here, Derry. Another way is possible. You can actually see protective and empowerment rights as truly complementary. And I'd like to encourage everybody to get yourself a copy of Another Way is Possible, which is Derry's book about his own experience running his public school classroom democratically. So what does it look like? What can it look like when protective and empowerment rights are both respected, protected, and promoted in complement to each other? Let's go on to the next slide. There's actually a growing number of schools or settings, even families now doing things the other way around, putting rights first, making education be one of the many rights that is respected and protected in the full array. And a lot of the schools and settings are inspired by ancestral role models. I'm just going to focus on 3 of the key ancestral role models. The first being Summer Hill School, which has been open for over 100 years now, still going strong, founded on the principle of freedom and allowing for full respect, equality, and participation of all ages. Nuestra Escuela in Puerto Rico, been going for more than 20 years, founded on the principle of love and allowing for full respect, equality, and participation between all ages. And then the Dom Ciro Orphanage, which ran between the world wars, based on the principle of trust, respect, equality, and participation between all ages. And here we are looking at dignity and rights coming first, whether or not it was defined that way, because obviously the first 2 of these preceded the United Declaration on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But putting the principle, the spirit of dignity and rights first, and then adding in education. So again, we are ending up with an aim for rights respecting education, but in this case, it is the rights respecting that becomes the priority. Next slide. So the first of these, we'll just take a little look at all 3. The first of these is Summer Hill, which was started in the early 1920s by A.S. Neal. He was a psychologist who actually believed that children should be treated with the same dignity and respect and given the same freedoms and rights as adults. And that's why he made it a boarding school, because he didn't particularly trust that 1920s parents would be able to treat their children in such a way that the children would actually be able to recover from the home experience enough to be empowered by their day at school. So he immersed them in a kind of an ongoing rights respecting environment that was only interrupted for a small part of their year. He was not interested in educational innovation. He was suspicious of it. I think he picked up that it could often become, sort of sugar coating to make the pill go down. So he left the curriculum exactly as it is, and the teachers simply taught it, but students to this day are free to not go to class. And there's a lovely big estate with, you can catch fish, you can climb trees, you can do pottery, you can ride your bike, you can play with your friends. So it's pretty usual for younger children to just not attend class until they get into their teen years. And rules and discipline cases and more are decided by a fully participatory meeting where every person has one vote, where the age range goes from 6, and the oldest staff are now over 70, and all of them really work in a collaborative way together. Next slide. Of course, a paternalistic attitude has led many people to worry about Summer Hill. If you haven't actually seen up close and in person how young people manage this kind of learning, then it can be very scary. So the UK government has tried to close it more than once. And I think it's significant that alumni clubbed together to pay for a really good lawyer, they were able to do that rather than all of them being sleeping under bridges, etc. So as much as it's hard to believe that letting children climb trees all day can result in effective education, 100 years of evidence suggests that it is as easy to get effective educational outcomes there as anywhere else, with empowerment rights fully lived. The foundational principle is really important to understand. Freedom, not license. People often imagine that it's about sort of a free-for-all where there's absolutely no responsibility, whereas there's always a kind of a proportional growth of the more responsible I can be, the more I can actually handle freedom and vice versa. And this ensures that the rights of the individual do not infringe on the rights of the person next door and are also not abused at the expense of the common interest. So this whole question in the world right now of, are we going for individualism or are we going for some kind of collective good? I really feel that this is already being thoroughly explored in democratic education. Next slide. So Nuestra Escuela was founded around 2000 in Puerto Rico by Justo Mendez Aramburu and Ina Iris Guzman Torres in response to the hopeless situation of school dropouts. Now, they actually approached these young people who had left school or been excluded from school, and they found that they actually did want educational support. And they asked them what kind of school they'd like. So these young people actually didn't care what kind of school it was. What they wanted was to be treated with love and respect. That is what had actually failed for them in the mainstream system. Treating them with love and respect very quickly, naturally, obviously, evolved into them being empowered, starting to participate in community management, and it also resulted in fully autonomous, personalized education. And by now, thousands of young people and their families have been empowered in these 20 years. They've even extended it into adult education and all sorts of community upliftment projects. If you can just give that a click there for me. This is in spite of the conventional paternalistic options having failed these families completely. They tried, it didn't work, they were written off, and this worked. Next slide. So I really want to highlight that right now in the world, it is the kids who are most at risk of becoming potential dropouts that actually fuel the paternalistic argument that they shouldn't have freedom, they shouldn't have empowerment, because this means they will leave school and never get to fulfill their right to education. And a lot of time and money is spent trying to force these young people back into the system, violating multiple other rights, just to get them to stay in a place that isn't working for them. If you look at truancy and the costs, both social and economic, of trying to combat truancy in paternalistic education systems, it's really a big issue. But the experience of Nuestra Escuela is that these students, in fact, want educational support. And exactly the key is to empower them and give them full autonomy and a lived experience of all of their rights, because that's what they require. So giving them their rights first and allowing that to be the route through which they access their education is actually what allows for their success. And I just cannot emphasize this point enough. Next slide. Now, the most poignant example is pediatrician Henrik Goldschmidt, best known as Janusz Korczak, and close colleague Stefania Wyszynska. They founded 2 orphanages in Poland in the early 1900s on the principle that children should be treated with love and respect. And Janusz actually wrote a number of books on parent and child relationships, many of which are still foundational in their concepts today. He believed that every child had rights, duties, and responsibility as every adult did. And the homes were run as children's republics, and they would convene courts as needed for dealing with grievances and cases of justice. And he really grasped this idea of protection and empowerment being complementary parts of a whole. This quote from him: "The relationship between adults, particularly caregivers, and children must never have the character of a struggle for authority and rights. Caregivers have an obligation to skillfully arrange conditions under which children may freely develop in the fullness of their rights." So you can see there, we're not simply abandoning the children to try and, sort of find their rights. We are creating and setting up the situation that they actually can freely develop safely, but in full autonomy and empowerment. And he lived this and he died this. He had the option of leaving the children to get onto the trains for extermination on their own, and he chose to go with them all the way, scaffolding for them that they would not have to deal with this on their own. Next slide. Yes, that's just my emphasis. You can click it again. That's just my emphasis that this is really an expression of autonomy and protection. And he's actually turned out to be one of the founding fathers of the whole children's rights movement. And ironically, much of the UNCRC is actually based on his work. And on the other hand, I say ironically because we're still trying to get to a place where that legacy is really fulfilled. He pointed out, he felt that it was actually lucky for us. It's humanity's good fortune that we don't succeed. We cannot force children to submit to their caregivers' influences or to didactic attacks on their sound mind and healthy human will. They tend to survive it rather often and keep their autonomy in spite of us rather often. But in this, he was also pointing out what Plato warned, that knowledge acquired under compulsion gains no hold on the mind. And we can see this all the time. Peter Gray has pointed out that, the so-called summer slide in the USA, where at the end of the school year, children have so-called learned certain things, and after a couple of months of holiday, they've forgotten all these things they so-called learned. Does that mean they actually learned them? How often do we need to refresh them? And then something that not many people notice, it's just taken for granted, when we get to the end of an academic year, the children have to spend huge amounts of energy studying for final exams on topics they spent the whole year learning. What is that about if they have actually learned these things? And why do we have to refresh and brush up on something before writing an exam a little while later, if we've actually learned these things? And in my WhatsApp groups are full of parents asking for somebody to help with the maths, even the primary school maths that all of these parents actually passed in their own time, but no longer know how to do. So what if empowerment is actually key to effective education, because that is actually what leads people to own and engage and internalize their learning? And what if paternalism, imposing education, is actually sabotaging educational outcomes rather than optimizing it? I mean, that's a question I think we need to engage with. Next slide. So one of the fears and motivations for a paternalistic approach is this idea that we must get children to cover a rounded curriculum, which will be better for them and for us than allowing them to select their own lines of study and skills development. Again, assuming that this can kind of be installed in them in a way that will stick. But what research on long-term outcomes actually supports this idea that this imposition is somehow important and useful and has good outcomes? Is it researched? Is it just an opinion? I'd like to offer a quote from another wonderful person that's present in this call today. Modern conventional education is full of impositions on its students. Schools often impose on students where they must be, what they must do and learn, how they must behave and communicate in the places and the ways that the teacher and school define. However, the legitimacy of this imposition, how much of this imposition is necessary, useful, justified, and desirable for education itself, has not been specifically discussed and analyzed yet. Analysis of imposition in education can help to address important questions of why oppression, alienation, if not even pedagogical violence, are so prevalent in organized education, and whether this can be avoided. I love this quote because it really makes us think in terms of, do we need to compromise on other rights in order to fulfill the right to education? What makes us feel that this is such a legitimate thing to do? Next slide. So perhaps paternalistic fears are correct in that early democratic schools such as Summerhill may have taken a very real risk in allowing a full lived experience of all rights, including empowerment rights, and pretty much waiting to see how education might work out once placed in the hand of the student. They didn't really know what was going to happen. But by now, we are quite lucky that they did this back then when they were allowed to and when they could get away with it, because we now have over 100 years of Summerhill graduates to look at, as well as literally hundreds of democratic schools that have popped up since then that allow full expression of the right to be heard, as well as the full range of other rights. Many of these schools allow even more academic freedom than Summerhill, in that they have an option to choose between different curricula and resources, as well as, with many of them, the option, very real option, of using no curriculum at all beyond that of emergent personal self-direction. And a lot of these have been going on long enough that we do also, again, have some idea of what the outcomes look like. Now, obviously, the outcomes are not going to exactly mimic the outcomes of schools which impose curricula. The chances of the majority of children autonomously choosing to stay inside the constraints of a curriculum is infinitesimally small. But that's also something important to note. If children given autonomy are not going to choose to stay inside the confines of a curriculum, what does that say about how likely it is that that has actually been designed to be something effective that should be imposed on them? But so far, those graduate follow-ups that have been done do suggest that while outcomes are different, they're pretty much just as good. And I'm going to quickly break and answer what I've just seen pop up in the chat there. Eugene, we have just resurrected a project to write a declaration of educational rights that we started a couple of years ago, and I will absolutely add you to that email list. And anybody else who wants to join that project, pop your email address in the chat and I'll add you too, because it's already got some good work underway, and it would be wonderful to have more collaborators to finish it up. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest worries is what I'm going to focus on when we quickly look at results, because there's just not time in a session like this to look at a whole range of different results from surveys. But one of the biggest worries that a paternalistic perspective has is if young people don't have curriculum and they don't have exam experience, they won't be able to engage at the tertiary level, and that's the fear. But the surveys seem to say that that's really not the case, that it's really the only real obstacle is the red tape that a lot of tertiary institutions have that don't allow young people to get in, because when they get in, they seem to do just fine. So next slide. Sudbury Valley School surveyed its own graduates and actually found that a higher proportion than mainstream went through tertiary education and did well there. Chanoff and Gray also independently surveyed the same schools graduates, I think not necessarily exactly the same cohorts, but found the same results. And very interesting, the Circle Schools survey in 2015 actually found a direct correlation between the number of years spent at the Circle School versus conventional education, versus mainstream education. And those who had spent 8 years or more, in other words, most of their formative years had been in the circle school environment, had a 91% college attendance rate compared to the national average of 60%, which really lends some credence to the assertion that many of us have, that imposition of educational process tends to lead to a kind of a learning fatigue and a learning aversion. Many kids want to kind of escape from education, whereas autonomy support in education tends to create lifelong learners who really enjoy it and just want to keep expanding into more and more stimulating environments. There have also been other studies on other spaces, as well as home education spaces, that emphasize rights of affirmation and autonomy. And all of these so far suggest that imposition isn't really necessary. Obviously, the number of studies is still small, and we're also doing some work now on trying to kind of create a bit of a global long-term database that people can add to. So if you're interested in that, pop your email in the chat too, and I can connect you up if you want to help with that. It's all volunteer-based. But so far, there isn't that kind of initial negative result that you expect to see from little pilot studies. We just can't find these kids who are supposedly living under bridges as a result of having too much educational autonomy. Next slide. So it really does look like putting rights first and allowing education to be one among many rights that is fulfilled, rather than using the right to education to justify compromising other rights, really does lead to acceptable outcomes. Next slide. Obviously, rights respecting participatory democratic education isn't a panacea. I don't think anyone has discovered a way to ensure that every single child thrives. But back to Eugene's quote, there is a very urgent need to consider, this is not a quote of his, but a paraphrase again of that idea, is there any real reason to limit or compromise the full range of children's rights, including empowerment rights such as the right to be heard and taken seriously, make educational decisions in an autonomous way, choose educational resources, environments, and support options by voting with one's feet? Is any of that imposition necessary in order to protect the fulfillment of the right to education? Next slide. So to wrap up, let's just take a quick look at each of the clauses that Sifaan highlighted. We look at Article 12, the right to be heard. We've got an example recently from Riverstone Village where there were a lot of problems in the sewing room, people not packing up, a sewing machine needle broken with nobody owning up. And there was a problem-solving session involving the people who used the sewing room, mostly driven by a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old. And they decided that there will be a sign-in process from now on in the sewing room. You'll have to have an orientation before you can enter, that you know what's expected of you, and then you'll have to sign in and sign out so that if someone arrives in the sewing room and finds a problem, they can simply go to the last person on the list to resolve it. Article 13, freedom of expression and being able to receive and seek and impart information from all sorts of sources. We had an orbital mechanics lesson take place at Riverstone a few days ago. There was a teenager who had agreed to help some of the younger kids with accessing a game called Kerbal Space Program, which involves the need to understand orbital mechanics. So he decided to start them off with a lesson in this, which they greatly enjoyed. He taught it, I think, like no adult could possibly teach it. And in the process, let's notice two things. Firstly, he himself has never had a formal physics lesson in his entire life. The first time he engaged with an official lesson in our space or anywhere else on physics was when he taught it. And secondly, it was quite interesting that one of the kids, a guest from outside, actually has family members who are flat earthers. who would not have been so happy for her to be exposed to this. But in this environment, the children are actually supported in getting many different points of view. Obviously, the regular Riverstone kids also got to hear her points of, well, not her own points of view, but her representing their points of view. And this is something that's very common in these spaces, is that people really get to grips, kids really get to grips with all of the variety in the world, so they can actually really learn real critical thinking. Then together with that, freedom of association, peaceful assembly, etc. Very popular at Riverstone, especially among the younger kids, experimenting with this by claiming particular spaces as clubhouses that they can have complete management over what happens there and how it's done, and really experiment with all of that. Next slide. Article 16, privacy. There's the obvious levels of privacy, of not interrupting somebody who's doing something and not exposing what they're doing, or so on. But I'd like to point out something that we don't often notice, which is the privacy over one's own learning process. I've seen a number of children now and heard about a number of further children who needed to learn to read in secret, that having their process exposed to somebody else while they were still grappling with it and not feeling certain about it, and maybe feeling a little sort of shy about it, would actually prevent them from engaging with the learn to read process. They would instead sort of hop out every now and again to ask something. I'm talking about hop out sort of over months, not over a session, but sort of here and there ask questions or notice something or ask for a resource. But in the end, everyone around them being pretty astonished that they had somehow learned to read, and one child actually saying that she had needed the privacy in order to be able to accomplish this. And I think this is an enormously important right in learning spaces that we're not often aware of. Article 19, protection from violence. To me, it seems a no-brainer that bullying and abuse are just easier to interrupt when the potential victims are empowered, know that they have a voice, and are safe to speak up. And we also find at Riverstone that there's quite a lot of peer education that goes around things like understanding why slurs are a problem, that actually proactively prevents the development and certainly prevents situations crystallizing that could turn into bullying and abuse. Article 28, discipline consistent with dignity. Well, the most dignified thing there is collaborative, transformative justice that's figured out as a problem solved between everyone involved. One example being a girl who forgot to turn the stove off on a regular basis, and instead of being made to feel bad about it or having her privileges taken away, there was a collaborative problem-solving session where she came up with the idea that she would wear one of the kitchen aprons and would only take it off once the stove was off. So if she found herself in the art room wearing the apron, she would know that she should run back to the kitchen and turn off the stove, and it worked a treat. I'm sorry, I'm just having a quick drink of water here. Article 31, play. Play is a right that is absolutely butchered in mainstream education. We're even looking at situations now. We've got some kids in our area who have to go to school 7 days a week right now. We've got schools in this city where the only break is just long enough to eat your food and go to the toilet, and then you're back to class. Whereas in a democratic education environment, play doesn't start or end, it's simply wall to wall. We had a lovely example of how much gets learned this way recently. We got a school in Chile contacting us saying, it'd be nice to have some Zoom calls and connect up. And we discussed this at meeting. And one of our staff members who did pass their matric in a conventional school and promptly forgot everything they weren't interested in, asked, is Chile in Africa somewhere? They were trying to place it. And one of our 6-year-olds, who's recently taken an interest in spinning the globe that we've got, said, no, Chile's that string next to Argentina. And it turned out that he actually pretty much knows his way around the whole of the planet by now. Next slide. So just closing up with a couple of quotes here. A.S. Neal, founder of Summerhill: the function of a child is to live their own life, not the life their anxious parents think they should live, nor a life according to the purpose of the educators who thinks they knows best. Next slide. And this is a picture of Nostra Escuela, just the feeling of that vibrant ability to contribute in solidarity to the achievement of the vision instead of having it imposed from the top down. Next slide. And finally, a quote from Janusz Korczak: children are not the people of tomorrow. They're the people of today. They have a right to be taken seriously and be treated with tenderness and respect. They should be allowed to grow into whoever they were meant to be. The unknown person inside each of them is our hope for the future. Final slide. So we are here. There was a lovely session on Suvamai in Estonia on Monday. The recording is available for that, and you can also hear Derry involved there quite extensively, as well as Charlie Marino Romero, which gives a very nice sort of fly on the wall look at what it can look like when we try to really bring rights more centrally into an otherwise imposed public school environment. And of course, Sifaan is here, founder of Kinder Republic or Kinder Republic, which is a fully democratic self-directed microschool in Sri Lanka. And I am here, founder and staff at Riverstone Village in South Africa. So what would you like to know from us further? And I think there's also quite a lot of people on the session who can also offer some amazing perspectives. So let's go into discussion. I think time is short.
Jana, thank you. There was a question in the chat sent about introverts and extroverts. I thought I would leave that for you to answer.
Okay, let me just quickly find it. I found children who are extrovert in one class and introvert in another, also the same school and home. Yes, definitely. So the thing is to allow enough space that extrovert and introvert children can balance themselves, right? So I noticed this when my son was very small, and I tried to take him to a kinder music class, and most of the other children would go and sit in the ring. They were about, I don't know, 2 years old, if that. And the other children would go sit in the ring and shake their shakers and look at each other and clap their hands. And my son and another child would go and look out of the window, you know, and go and look at the different thing in the room. And then when they would get home, well, my child, when he got home, he would want to sing the same songs with just me that he had been exposed to over there. So in our space at Riverstone, there's always places that a child can withdraw and go and have some alone time to recharge. There's always ways that they can choose to catch up on material that other children chose to have a class on, if they chose to have a class, for example. And then they can actually regulate their own engagement. At Riverstone, we even allow, we don't have mandatory attendance. So there are some kids who find they just max out if they come every single day of the week. They can take the pajama day whenever they need to. And yeah, we see learning as a 24/7 thing. So my son didn't particularly engage in anything interactive about physics at Riverstone until he started teaching it. Was the first time he started interacting around it. I don't know if that answers you. Was there another one you wanted me to tackle?
I think I answered that in the chat about whether everyone is listened to. So I don't know if that answer was not sufficient, then please.
Yes. Can I quickly address that? Are all children listened to? Because I see that is a different concern, and I'd love to address that. So again, when children are able to shape the space, what we found at first is, you know, we started with the conventional thing of you have to come to meeting to say your thing, right? And then because the children could shape things, There were some children who were like, but I don't want to come to meeting and have to talk in front of everybody. So then we were like, well, how should we solve that? And over the years, they've come up with a number of solutions that work for them personally. Some children prefer to have a suggestion box where they can drop something written that anyone can help them write. That's not working at the moment because nobody wants that at the moment. So the current thing we have at the moment is that you can ask somebody else to speak for you at meeting, and you don't even have to be there. You just have to have given them the brief. So it's really about having a spirit where everybody knows that they are empowered to help find ways to have their needs met. Democratic schools are usually pretty small because they are communities. So sort of 200 is probably about the maximum.
I think it's also a case there that in the mainstream system, you want to the school is one physical entity, so everything gets centralized into that. So your playground, your swimming pool, your library, your whatever everything is in one place. And in democratic schools, it's not necessarily that the school is that place that is a meeting place, a hub, but the entire at the city is your school. So you, if you want to go to the library, you'll go to the library. If you want to go to some play park, you'll go there. If you want to go to the supermarket, you'll go there. So all of those things are learning spaces. Some may need, some children may need more support navigating them than others. So you figure out how you do that. That support doesn't necessarily have to come from an adult. So I know in some democratic schools, the license to leave the premise is on the basis that my child can go out if he's a part of a group of at least six or something like that, where then there's that sense of collective safety that they can look after each other. With some children who may need additional support, the parent might say, no, my child can only go out if they are accompanied by an adult. But it varies like that. And so because you have that sort of sense that there are so many things around you, you don't have to then try to pile up more and more children into one space. So if there was a demand for more children to join, then the space could allow, you'd probably have another space nearby that then supports more children, and then sometimes people might visit from one to the other. They both share whatever common facilities in the city. In Israel, they're actually working on this concept of education city. So that rather than education being seen as being in a school, education is seen as being located in a city. How do schools get funded? So in a few countries, there is public funding. So in Israel, the state runs a democratic school. In Taiwan, there is funding for alternative education. In Germany, because of the way the law is, private schools don't charge fees, but the state will pay for it. In the US, some states have school choice vouchers kind of things that you can use the funds that would have been available for the public school system to be used in a Sudbury school. I know in Miami they do that, but sorry, I just realized my video was off. In most places, it is funded from fees that are paid by the families who participate. Yana, do you know how it is in Puerto Rico? How is their funding?
So in Puerto Rico, Justo actually took the right to education and forced the government to pay by suing them continuously. And he actually uses every piece of public funding that goes up. He applies for example, protection from violence, programs against gender-based violence. He shows how his program is actually in line with, creating these common goods, and then he goes and basically makes them pay. It's amazing. I wish I had that kind of chutzpah and capacity, honestly.
Put it in the chat. I am going to just drop my email address in the chat as well. So if anybody wants to follow up or stay in touch, you can send me an email. And then also if you want to get access to the recording once we upload it, you can let me know. Okay, just to pick up on something that came up in the chat earlier when we were talking about the image about the teacher and the quote about the teachers in some UN report, it obviously doesn't mean that there is no role for an adult to play and that adults abscond from their responsibilities and duties. It's just that whether we engage in that in a way that is rights affirming or in a way that is paternalistic. So I can just share a small anecdote. My son was asking me a question on something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I then tried to sort of facilitate for him to find the answer himself. So I was trying to ask him some questions, and he told me, "No, I don't want you to ask me questions. I want you to tell me the answer." And then I sort of realized to recognize what was happening. So I stopped trying to facilitate anything and I just answered the question he was asking because I think we should be able to trust that when they come and ask a question, they know what they're asking for. And if they're asking the wrong question and they get the wrong answer, then that's also part of the natural learning experience of figuring it out, and we should not be assuming that we know better than them what is the right question to ask for their needs. So on that note, anybody who wants to say anything or ask anything, I'm not going to sort of dig into the chat and see if there were questions there because I think that would be quite awkward, but you can just speak.
So I'd love to respond to the question that Rona just popped into the chat. She was asking when these kinds of schools get started, do they consult with young people at all? So I don't know about other schools, but obviously with Nuestra Escuela, it was definitely a co-creation. And I know with our own Riverstone Village, we had a number of kids in our founders group and other kids that we encountered in places like parkour lessons and things like that. It was very much a co-creation. And in fact, the name Riverstone Village took about 2 days to come to because we had a group of young people brainstorming their favorite words and favorite associations for how they wanted it to be and then refining it. And, you know, it had many different possible names and eventually came down to Riverstone Village. And then we also fundraised by actually creating a stage play that we performed for public for payment in the school holidays. It was that good. It worked and it raised us enough money to at least get started. And that whole play was really about the right to education. And it was the script was created from a place of asking the children what they wanted to be in this play and what they wanted to be about and what they wanted their characters to do. So yes, I think it is very possible to involve young people in the co-creation of these spaces. And I highly recommend, it's a very good idea. And then also on our very first day, the first thing we did was say, who wants to decide what we need to agree to make it a safe and pleasant place to be here? And almost everybody decided to come into the circle and create some initial rules.
Hi, this is Peter, and thank you both for a great presentation today. I know it might feel like preaching to the choir, but I think we still need to do that sometimes because, you know, coming in here and listening to what both of you had to say, it reminded me of a lot of things, but it also made me reframe some things in my mind, which I think is really important. And yeah, we do preach to the choir, and yeah, we're like, yeah, we all agree, and we're all nodding our heads. But I think, sometimes to have a different angle or a different just an idea or approach or even different wording, I think sometimes is really helpful. And I just wanted to comment on, a child coming to you and saying, "Hey, I just want you to tell me the answer." And I've experienced that, where I think, sometimes you're in the, you're trying to get them to think through things and you'll ask them questions and when they're kind of used to that process and they're in it, sometimes they just know they want to, like, I just want you to tell me. And I think to me that's self-directed. because what they're asking for what they need. And if they're going into it knowing that, okay, I'm asking for a direct answer, I'm going to get a direct answer, that's self-direction. And I often say that too, is when, we advocate for school choice and students making their own choice. If a student chooses to say, go to a military academy, which, I know around the world there are some, if they know exactly what that means and they really fully understand and they're the ones who are choosing it, I mean, to me, that is self-direction. Now, it wouldn't be something I would personally choose for myself or maybe even really recommend to anyone. But if someone is fully choosing that on their own, then, that's self-direction.
I think there's
Completely
an
agree.
Yeah. I think there's an important distinction to make, which is something I've been speaking about recently as well, between sort of pedagogical approaches. Uh, so a one-way lecture, or the military school sort of example that Peter was making, or a sociocracy. So these are all different methods of doing things, and democracy isn't or rights isn't really about the approach or pedagogical tool in that sense. So a lot of times democratic schools are more open and less rigid in their structure and things like that. But if the people in that space want it to be more rigid, if they want to have retributive justice, if they want to have strict timetables, then I think the people involved should facilitate that as much as possible. It actually even, I think, came up in some comment that somebody said, we can't say that democratic education is for everybody, because we have had some people wanting to transfer to conventional mainstream schools. And I'm like, but that is entirely democratic. If somebody is saying, I know what this is, I understand what it means, and I want to go there, then to insist that no, you have to stay here in this free place that you can run around in the woods all day long and you can't go there would be actually undemocratic.
So just a codicil on that, I think the one thing to be aware of, I think, as well, is that when we talk about democracy, many people assume we mean a kind of a representative majority rule, whereas I think most of our spaces actually operate on a kind of a participatory basis, for which I don't know that there's quite the right word yet. So when you're talking about if the people there want to do something rigid and imposed, we should facilitate that. Yes, while also making sure that any minorities that don't want that are also accommodated. So I think that's also one of the things that's really an important principle, is that's where we constantly balance the rights of the individual and the desires of the whole, that we can never use the desires of the whole to create something that's oppressive and inappropriate for some of the individuals.
That's it. That reminds me, when you're saying that, of the Iroquois Confederacy, here in the States, the indigenous tribes that were here, especially on the eastern portion of the nation, actually had what there was a confederacy where all the different nations were represented. And so it was kind of a mixture of representative democracy, participatory democracy, which you were talking about. But I think the thing that was really the distinction is that they made sure to represent the minority voices as well. So, a lot of times in democracy, it's especially, with some of the democracies that are more well known, a lot of things are decided by a two-thirds vote. And so, but what happens to the third of the people that didn't vote for that, or maybe had some issue with it, or maybe are not even quite sure how it works? And so I think, there's a good model there to look at. And I think what's come up a lot, at least in my discussions, is that when you're practicing democratic process, sometimes on a smaller scale, you can do that a little more easily. But I'm sure all of you know Yaakov Hecht and what they're doing in Israel with the democratic schools there. And they have practice, that's on a much bigger scale. And so it seems like they've sort of figured some of that out as well. And you can do it on a bigger scale. So again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but yeah, it is, and I'm using air quotes. I know no one can see me, but easier when there's a smaller group of people. But I only think that that's only because you're allotting the time. And I think you can do that with a bigger group as long as you're allotting the time. And if people sometimes in a bigger group, if they don't want to participate, that's fine as long as they're, fully understanding what that means. Hey, I didn't show up to have a say, and I might have to go along with some things, that were decided. And yeah, I could always express, how I feel about that, but I didn't show up, and so I think I don't know. There's just a lot about democratic process that's really interesting, and again, representing, the voice of people who maybe were, I don't know, outvoted or maybe didn't get a chance to vote. I think, is really important. There are a lot of models out there that do that, and do that well. And, it's not always an easy thing to do, but it is very doable.
Yeah, agreed. And in the previous session this morning, one of the questions was, the balancing between the extrovert kids and the introvert kids, and do the introvert kids also get a say and also get heard? And there again, when young people are involved in solving the issues, you get to solutions that actually work for the individuals there. So at one stage we had like an anonymous box that you could write something or get someone to help you write something and put in, and that worked for certain people at that time. Whereas right now that's not really wanted. Right now what's wanted is to ask somebody else to speak at meeting on your behalf, and you can explain everything to them. And sometimes that person runs and consults you in the middle of meeting and then runs back, or you sit next to the person and whisper in their ear. The point is that things can be fluid, and agile and adaptable and diverse according to the needs that arise at the time. And also then one of the processes that's evolved at Riverstone now is that anybody who even abstains, never mind votes against, but even if you abstain from a vote, the chair then asks, would you like to speak to your abstention? And you can simply say, no, I'm fine, thank you. Or you can explain why you're abstaining. And then that generally goes into another round of discussion, which usually ends up with a better solution that's more inclusive. So yeah, the moment that you create a meta level of participation, that people can participate in actually making sure that the participation works, then it really gets very interesting and quite effective. I see Derry's going to have a chat to us. Derry, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I was going to try and jump in, but I can't see how I can put my hand up. Ah, there it is. I'm just very interested on the question of the extent to which young people have been consulted in founding democratic schools or creating democratic schools. Anna, in her comments, refers to the first democratic high school, the Forsøksgym, in Oslo, the FGO as it was called. This is a very fascinating story from 1968, because this upper secondary school was actually created by young people, a bunch of young people who were fed up with the authoritarian regimes in their lower secondary schools in Oslo, circulated the students in all the lower secondary schools and said, how many of you would be interested in starting a school along the lines we want? And this sort of thing can only really happen in Scandinavia and perhaps only in Norway. The kids found someone who was willing to be head teacher, a great person called Mosse Jorgensen, who I shared a platform with at the anniversary of the FGO just before it closed a few years ago. They approached her and she agreed to be the head teacher. She was the sort of A.S. Neil of Norway. And she encouraged the kids, if you apply to the city council, see if they can find you a building. So, and then they applied to the national ministry. And the national ministry said, if the municipality will find a building for you, we'll pay for 15 teachers' salaries for the first 3 years. It's such a Scandinavian story, but it's lovely. And the school survived for about 40 years. And when I talked with people in the Norwegian Ministry of Education about its closure, they said it really doesn't matter that it's closed because its sheer existence has had a massive impact on relationships between adults and young people in all Norwegian secondary schools. It's a lovely story. And Anna's referred to an article in the journal of, is Anna still here?
Yes, I'm here. If you can, yeah, I would really love to talk more about it because I studied, in this special issue that I'm referring to. There are 4 articles that I wrote, some of them together with some colleagues, and especially a deep study of one very intense meeting that the founders of the school, the students, had in the 2 months after they founded it. And the transcript was preserved, and lots of the ideas that we are discussing today were at that time so prominent, like the principles of love as a first principle of education, the principle of freedom, but also the opposition, the understanding among some of the students that school is school. There is no variation of, we know what is it for, a very conservative view. But I think it was a fascinating project and very important, but you seem to know people from there and I don't. So I would love to talk to you about it.
Well, let's do that. I'll put my email in the chat. I'd love to talk to you about it.
Please, yes.
Mosse Jorgensen was the first principal, and she just was a fantastic character. And you very rarely hear her name mentioned. You often hear about A.S. Neil, but you don't often hear of Mosse Jorgensen.
She was very, yeah.
Sorry.
I first heard about her, the book she wrote about that school in 1971 was translated into Serbo-Croatian, and I come from Yugoslavia, and it was very influential. It was translated in 1977 and published about the school that's founded by the students, and it was incredibly influential actually on the preschool education movement at that time in the 70s and 80s in Yugoslavia, that was trying to build a new model that's founded on autonomy and dignity of the very young preschool child.
I think it is also interesting what Derry was saying about this kind of thing could only happen in Scandinavia or in Norway because the nature of the democracy in the society around us obviously influences how we see democracy, how we practice democracy in education as well. And in that sense, it's interesting that UK has, or at least until recently had, I'm not sure what's going to change there, quite open policies about elective homeschooling, where what is adequate education isn't even very strictly defined, but they are also very hard on schools like Summerhill. So if you are, there's a lot of freedom in home education, but if you choose to name yourself a school, then suddenly there's a lot of rules and regulations. It was also interesting that Peter mentioned the Iroquois Confederacy, because sometimes the narratives that get picked up tend to reflect the existing systems of oppression in the world, and colonizers' voices tend to be heard more than the people who are colonized. So the Iroquois story was useful to remind somebody. I think at the chat had mentioned about Maria Montessori. I'm just wondering also this Norwegian lady you're talking about, whether her work was in Norwegian, which made it less accessible until somebody translated it. And another point I sometimes like to make is that democracy itself is very much a work in progress everywhere in the world. So it's kind of obvious that democratic education could also then be a work in progress. And if when people talk about democracy being in something evolving, they usually start the story with the Magna Carta, which is, I think, also a very kind of Eurocentric view of the world, because was there no other discourse on human rights in any other culture anywhere in the world? And I think there were. It's just that it's not part of that narrative.
Another, maybe I could chip in another one here on the question of civil rights, civil disobedience within schools against school rules. You might be amused to have a look at a school in London called Michaela, Michaela, founded by someone who believes in very, very strict discipline. And this school has been getting quite high academic examination results. But now there's been an outbreak of student rebellion against the rules, such as not being able to talk in corridors between lessons, etc., etc., only looking at the teacher when the teacher is talking. Some quite extraordinary stuff that spread to other schools, so that we now have a government-appointed behaviour czar whose job it is to try and propagate these methods throughout the school system, to the enormous harm of very many young people, especially if you read the work of Naomi Fisher. Anyway, this school is Michaela. If you look in an English newspaper such as The Guardian, you'll find reports of the students' demonstrations against the regime in the school, which are interesting.
Isn't this the one that's in the news about the prayer ban or something like that, or is that somewhere else?
Yes, no, that's the one. I'm going to chip in. Last time, I promised, but one of the things that emerged out of the Forsøksgym in Oslo, which means experimental gymnasium, experimental upper secondary school, was the foundation of a school students organization in Norway, which is incredibly well organized, called Elevorganisasjonen i Norge. It's students' democracy in every school, which has now created, at the students' request, ombudsman, education ombuds in every Norwegian county. And the school students' organization in the school has the power, if the head teacher is, for example, tolerating bullying, the school students' organization in the school can ask the education ombud from the county to come to the school, and the head teacher has to sit down with the ombud and the students. And if the head teacher takes no action despite the intervention of the ombud, there can then be a criminal prosecution against the head teacher. And this whole innovation has come from the school students themselves, organized nationally.
This is fascinating. I didn't know all of that because I just worked with the texts and wow.
Of course, school students' organizations are very strong in all the Nordic countries, and that includes Finland. The Swedish-speaking school students' organization, you know, the Swedes are a minority in Finland, I think about 7 or 8%, but they have a very effective school students' organization, which has run a project on democratizing the Swedish-speaking schools in Helsinki. And this project was run jointly by students and teachers. And in fact, the student who initially organized it and wrote the report is now the international research officer for the International Teachers Union Organization, EI, Education International, which is an interesting example of someone who's come through school democracy, who's now playing a fairly key role internationally. Her name is Antonia Wolf, by the way, Antonia Wolf.
Every time I meet you somewhere, you have all these little anecdotes and stories about people and places and things like that. And I wish you would find some way to maybe either write this down or video or some format where you can capture this so so that the access to that doesn't depend on bumping into you on a Zoom call.
I'm very old, Sifaan. That's the answer. I've met an awful lot of people, and I've realized after I reached 150, my main job in life was just plugging people into each other as a sort of international networking agent. It's worth doing.
It is worth it.
And very grateful we all are. Thank you. You've been a wonderful networker.
Yeah.
I think we'll wind up in maximum 9 minutes more. Is there anybody who didn't get a chance to speak because we were sort of monopolizing? I noticed Fardeen or somebody from Kikau Cultures is here.
That'll be Fardeen. I think he's only just arrived, so I'm not sure that Fardeen. I'm not sure if you are up to speed on what we're busy with. I think yeah, we'll send a recording out to him.
Jana, I put my email in the chat. Could I just say that if anyone tries to get hold of the book and can't, just email me and I'll send you a free of charge PDF of the final draft.